So I feel like it's time to crunch some numbers here because, as I said, I did a recent video about why the US has such a high homicide rate compared to other first world countries. And I've actually crunched the numbers a bit more, and I found that my findings support my conclusion. My conclusion was basically that the issue in the US is a combination of mostly two categories, with perhaps a third one trailing behind. And those two main categories are A, the demographics, like the different groups that you have living there in predominant numbers in terms of, racial slash ethnic groups. With obviously the ones with the highest homicide rates being the African American population, as well as Native Americans and Hispanic Americans who are predominantly mestizos. So those three groups in particular, but with the African American population having the highest per capita homicide rate by far. So that's the first factor. The second factor is access to guns. Because as I found out, like I looked at the statistics in terms of firearms per capita. Now, these are 2017 statistics. The US has by far the highest in the world, 120.5 per 100,000, which is, or is that per, sorry, that's not per 100,000. Sorry, my bad. No, that's actually like, I think per 100. So firearms actually outnumber human beings in the United States. So that it's the highest in the world by far. The next highest countries are less than half as much. And for reference, Canada scored at a 34.7 per 100. And the highest in Europe was Finland, which scored at 32.4 per 100. And then Iceland at 31.7. And then Austria at 30.0. And the rest of the European countries kind of trail behind Austria there. So we can see there that there's way more guns in the United States. Like, I'm not sure what the laws are on guns on each country, and obviously they vary within each country also, depending on where you are. But regardless of the question of like what the laws are, the fact is there are just way more guns in the United States. So there is that. So the combination of demographics plus guns are the two main factors. Now, I think there's the possible third contributing factor is the fact that the U.S. is a bit less generous in terms of welfare and gives me dats compared to a lot of Western European countries. However, the reason why I don't think this is the main factor, and a lot of liberals think it is the main factor, but I disagree. Well, liberals would say it's guns plus lack of gives me dats. They would say it's that the demographics are not the root problem. But where I would disagree is, well, A, I do think the demographics themselves are a large part of the root problem, and B, in terms of the access to welfare being the issue, I think it's somewhat of an issue. Like, lack of access to welfare for poor people can make them more prone potentially to committing acts of violence. But the reason why I don't think it's as big a factor is because from what I've seen, now the statistics are harder to find for this, but from what I've seen, the discrepancy between the US and other first world countries for other crimes other than murder is a lot less than for murder. Like when you look at the rates for burglary, robbery, theft, like those are the types of crimes that I would think would be more linked to poverty than anything, is like stealing, any type of stealing, whether it be burglary, theft, robbery. And for those types, the discrepancy is a lot less. So I'm going to say that poverty and access to welfare, it might be a factor, but I don't think it's the main factor. Like you could say, yeah, like the economic system in that sense, how it creates more poverty and how people have less access to welfare. Again, like I think if that was the main factor, it would be more shown in like the US having higher rates of burglary, robbery, theft, and crimes like that. But in reality, the discrepancy is a lot greater from what I've seen. Now, again, those statistics are limited for, like, it's easy to find those statistics for the US and Canada, but it's very hard to find those statistics for Europe. Like, I've only seen a very few statistics on that for Europe, and they don't seem necessarily reliable, and they're only for a few countries. And also, the statistics I found for Europe directly contradict themselves, like from one source to another, for the same country. So honestly, uh, for all the intents and purposes, I haven't been able to find reliable statistics for any European country for crimes other than murder. The only one I have been able to find reliable statistics for is Canada. And from what I've seen, the discrepancy is far greater for murder between the US and Canada than for other crimes. For other crimes, usually the US is higher, but it's not by nearly the same margin as murder. Interestingly, Canada's actually scored higher for, I think, bicycle theft per capita, which might be because more Canadians ride bicycles. And I forget if it was for auto theft also. It may have been. I'm not sure. Actually, I don't think it was. I think what it was is like nationwide. We scored close, but I think the US scored higher. I might be wrong on that one. But I do think certain Canadian cities like Vancouver scored extremely high. So yeah. But anyway, so that all aside, why I bring this up is to just illustrate the point that like what I'm talking about here is murder. It's not really other crimes. Like I don't think the same discrepancy necessarily exists with other crimes. But yes, with murder, the US has a much higher murder rate than other first world countries, particularly than European countries, like Western European countries in particular. So the myth that I'm trying to dispel here is I hear a lot of people saying, like right wingers saying, that white Americans would have the same homicide rate as white people in Western Europe. And frankly, I'm sorry to say it, but I'm pretty sure that is bullshit. Now, here's the thing. It's actually impossible to find what the murder rate is for non-Hispanic whites in the US. The problem is the FBI, for their murder, like for all their statistics, they lump white people together with Hispanics. So it's impossible to see like what is the non-Hispanic white murder rate overall. However, what you can find is like I suppose one way of doing it would be to you can find the black murder rate and then you can find the Hispanic murder rate and then you can subtract those and I guess the Native and Asian ones from the total number and get white non-Hispanic. I didn't do that. Maybe I could. But what I did was I looked at the 10 whitest states and then I took the overall murder rate from those states and compared it to all the countries of Western Europe. So the 10 whitest states in terms of non-Hispanic white population. So that's white people who do not check off Hispanic. Because the problem is in the US, Hispanic is not considered a race on the census. It's a separate category. So a lot of Hispanics, like they have a list to choose from for race and it doesn't include Hispanic or mestizo. So they will just select white because they view that as like the closest to what they are because they're not given Hispanic or mestizo as an option for that question. They're only given it as an option for the next question, which is, are you Hispanic or not? So it creates a really confusing situation. So that's why the number I'm going with is non-Hispanic white, because if you have the total white people who identify as white, the problem is you get a lot of Hispanics who aren't really white. That being said, there are some white Hispanics. Like I am not a white Hispanic denier. Like there is such a thing as white Hispanics. I know plenty of white Hispanics. In fact, like half my friends on my Fashy Facebook account are basically white Hispanics. They do exist, okay? Like, I have plenty of personal friends who are white people from Latin America. They do exist. I am not trying to deny their existence by using this statistic. It's just that when measuring the U.S. white population, it's like, you kind of have to go with this because it's like there's so many non-white Hispanics who are erroneously considered white if you look at the total quote-unquote white population. Now, that being said, you could also say non-Hispanic whites may include some people who we wouldn't consider white, such as Jews and also, bizarrely, Middle Easterners, because they don't have their own category, like people from the Middle East or North Africa. So I would say overall, like, if you subtracted those, like the Jews and the Middle East, North Africa people, and then you added the Hispanics that actually were white, uh, the actual white population would probably come pretty close to the non-Hispanic white population. It might be actually a little bit higher because I would think white Hispanics might overall outnumber Jews plus Middle Easterners and North Africans. I could be wrong, but anyway, that would be my guess. So yeah, the non-Hispanic white population, the 10 highest states are Maine with 88.9%, West Virginia 88.8%, Vermont 88.2%, New Hampshire 85.6%, North Dakota 83.1%, Iowa 82.1%, Montana 81.5%, Kentucky 80.8%, Wyoming also 80.8%, and then South Dakota 79.0%. And these statistics are for 2022. Now, one thing that I should add is that a lot of people point out blacks have by far the highest homicide rate in the US, but almost all these states have a very low black population by US standards. Like from the statistics I have for black population, now these are from 2020, so it's 2 years earlier than the non-Hispanic white statistics, but all of these states are below 5% black, with the exceptions of Iowa, which is 5.14% black, and then Kentucky, which is 8.09% black. So, and then after that, like a lot of them are really low. Like you have West Virginia is 3.76% black, North Dakota is 3.9% black, but the rest, which is the 6 remaining ones, are all less than 2% black. So Maine is 1.9%, Vermont 1.4%, New Hampshire 1.5%, Montana 0.5%. Yeah, people give the TV show Yellowstone shit for not having enough black characters when the black population of Montana is a whopping 0.5%. And then Wyoming is 0.91%. So, and South Dakota is 2.24%. So yeah, all things considered, these states do not have a high black population. The only one with a black population that is like much higher is Kentucky with 8.09%. So if you want to like disregard Kentucky for that reason, then fine. I understand that because that is, like Kentucky out of those states is probably the only one that has a higher black percentage than any Western European country, with the possible exceptions of France and Portugal. The rest of these states, I would say, including Iowa at 5.14%, are probably pretty closely in line with the black percentage of each of these Western European countries. And then, of course, you have to account like these Western European countries have other non-white demographics which might skew their homicide rate also. In addition to blacks, there's also a lot of Middle Easterners and North Africans. Like, to my understanding, Middle Eastern and North African demographics don't have a terribly high crime rate in the United States or Canada, really, but in Western Europe, it's a different story. Also in Western Europe, there's, of course, the... I don't know if I'm going to get flagged for using the other term for these people, so I will just say my apologies to Romanians for using this term, but the Romani people. I know that Romanians don't like that word. I don't like that word either. It's a made-up word, but I don't want to say words that are going to get me in trouble. The G word, the other G word. There's a lot of G words, but yeah. You all know who I'm talking about. So yeah, these groups might offset the total in Western Europe also. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Western Europe is not 100% white either. So these groups will affect the total there too. So when looking at homicide rates for these top 10 whitest U.S. states for 2021, okay, so the homicide rate per 100,000, Maine 1.7, West Virginia, 6.9, Vermont, 3.9. Now, in Vermont, this statistic is for 2022, and it actually was a bit of a spike that year. New Hampshire 1.96, also 2022, also a bit of a spike that year. North Dakota 3.4, Iowa 3.2, Montana 4.4, Kentucky, which as I said is the outlier for having a higher black population, 9.6. Wyoming 2.24. Now this was for 2019 because I couldn't find more recent for Wyoming. South Dakota was 5.3. So when looking for all these, with the exception of Kentucky, they all range from 1.7 on the low end, which is Maine, to 6.9 on the high end, which is West Virginia. And West Virginia, interestingly, is the second highest for white population. But it has a higher homicide rate than all the others of the top 10 whitest, with the exception of Kentucky. Now, keep in mind, the overall homicide rate in the U.S. for 2022 is 6.4. Now, most of these numbers are 2021. I don't have off the top of my head the overall for 2021, but I think it's a bit lower, but I think it's definitely 5+. Like, it's been 5+ for quite a while in the U.S. So as we can see, all of these states, most of these states are significantly below the U.S. average, with the exception of Kentucky, which is significantly higher than the U.S. average, and then West Virginia, which is a little bit higher than the U.S. average. Now, what's interesting about Kentucky and West Virginia, these are states that have very high poverty rates. These are, I think, the heart of the opioid epidemic in eastern Kentucky and western West Virginia. And I've actually seen a map somewhere that I saw of homicide rate by county in the U.S., and those regions are fairly high. These are probably like the highest homicide rates of white people, possibly anywhere on the planet. Eastern Kentucky and western West Virginia. It's a region that's predominantly white and also very decimated by the opioid epidemic, very poor. Except for maybe, okay, there could be somewhere in Russia that might have a higher white homicide rate, or maybe somewhere in like the southern, South America maybe, but definitely in a first world country, I would guess western West Virginia, eastern Kentucky probably have the highest white homicide rate. That being said, Kentucky does also have a significant black population, so that's definitely a contributor in Kentucky as well, like in Louisville especially, and probably Lexington also. West Virginia, the black population is only 3.76%, so I mean, they might be a bit of a contributor, but not a huge one at those numbers. So yeah, but overall, despite those two exceptions, like overall, 8 out of these 10 states have homicide rates that are under the U.S. average. South Dakota's approaching the U.S. average, so like 7 out of 10 have homicide rates that are significantly lower than the U.S. average. So, and overall, like, when you look at the states with the highest homicide rates, it's almost all like states with a very high black population. So yes, there is definitely a correlation. However, when you look at Europe, holy shit. Okay, so you want to know the homicide rates for Europe. These are, okay, Austria, per 100,000. Okay. Austria, 0.9. That's from 2022. Belgium, 1.1. That's from 2021. Denmark, 1.0. 2022. Finland, 1.2. 2022. France, 1.1. 2021. Germany, 0.8, 2021. Greece, 1.1, 2022. Iceland, 0.5, 2021. Ireland, 0.9, 2022. Malta, 0.4, 2021. Luxembourg, 1.5, 2022. Netherlands, 0.8, 2022. Norway, 0.6, 2022. Portugal, 0.8, 2021. Spain, 0.7, 2022. Sweden, 1.1, 2022. Switzerland, what the fuck does that say? 0.5, 2022. UK, 1.0, 2020. So as we can see here, every single Western European country has a lower homicide rate than all of the 10 whitest US states. And again, many of these Western European countries might have, but they probably have a white population that's comparable largely, like the percentage, to the top 10 whitest US states. I would guess France might actually be lower than any of those, and Portugal might actually be lower than any of those. The thing is, it's hard to find racial statistics for most European countries for their overall population, with the exception of the UK, I think. But I would guess most of them would, like, the 10 whitest US states range from 79.0% to 88.9%. I would say that would be fairly consistent with the white percentages of these European countries, with the exception, as I said, France and Portugal might actually be lower. But yeah, again, as I said, these are Western European countries. I'm not looking at Eastern Europe here. But when looking at Western Europe specifically, yeah, they all have lower homicide rates. And also keep in mind, many of these Western European countries might actually have comparable or higher black percentages compared to these US states, with the exception of Kentucky. Like, with the exception of Kentucky, okay, Iowa's 5.14%, so that might be comparable to like UK or many of the Western European countries, but a lot of these are like 3% or lower, which is probably less than many of these Western European countries have. So again, like, now the only Western European countries that actually had higher homicide rates, which I didn't mention in those, but because I think it's kind of bullshit, is Andorra, 2.6 per 100,000. That's in 2020. And then Liechtenstein, 5.1 per 100,000. That's in 2021. The reason why I don't think it's fair to even count those is that those are microstates that have hardly any population. So literally, if like one person gets murdered there, the homicide rate will spike like crazy. So I don't think it's fair to even include those. But yeah, all of the non-microstates in Western Europe have a lower homicide rate than every single one of the top 10 whitest US states. Like, for context, Maine was the lowest at 1.7. And the highest non-microstate, well, it barely counts as a non-microstate, is Luxembourg. And frankly, it borders on being a microstate. That's 1.5. And then the highest after Luxembourg was I think Finland at 1.2. And Finland, by the way, does have a slightly higher gun ownership rate than the other European countries. And I know it's had a higher homicide rate in the past too, like a little bit higher than now, so, and higher than the rest of Western Europe by a little bit. So again, that could be, like, guns could be a little bit of a contributing factor in Finland also. I know Finland has also had more mass shootings than other European countries, so there is that factor too. So overall, I do think this supports my conclusion, which is that it's a combination of both demographics and guns. That those are the two main contributing factors toward the higher homicide rate. Now, as I've said, there could be trade-offs though, because I think it's possible that having more guns can actually reduce some other types of crime, like crimes other than homicide, like burglary, or certain property crimes like theft, burglary, vandalism, mugging, whatever. Like, there could actually be potentially reductions in these crimes, because if people are afraid that the victim might have a gun, they may be less likely to commit these crimes. But I do think having more guns does lead to more murders. But as I've said, it's a combination of both factors, guns plus vibrancy. It's not necessarily one or the other. But I do think even when you look at the white US population, they do, like, from these statistics, I would guess that the white US population probably does have a significantly higher homicide rate than the white European population. Like, judging from these statistics, like, I would guess the white European, I'm just pulling this number out of my ass, but judging from the statistics for Europe, I would guess the white European population might have a homicide rate in Western Europe of maybe 0.8 or 0.7 per 100,000. Again, this is lower than the overall because I'm guesstimating what it would be if you took the non-whites out of the equation for Western Europe. So I'm guesstimating, pulling this completely out of my ass, 0.7, 0.8 per 100,000 for whites in Western Europe. From these statistics that I'm seeing here for the United States, I would guesstimate, again, pulling this completely out of my ass, that the white homicide rate would be somewhere between 2 per 100,000 and maybe 3 per 100,000. It could be slightly lower, like maybe 1.75 to 3 per 100,000. Now, one bias here is that, again, it's possible that the whitest states might actually have a higher white homicide rate than states with a lower white population. That is actually quite possible. But still, I would guess, my guesstimate, if I had to pull a number out of my ass, would be, I would guess the white homicide rate in the US is probably something close to like between 2 and 2.5 per 100,000. So that would still be significantly higher than Western Europe. That would be 3 to 4 times as high per capita. So again, it's nowhere near as high as the black homicide rate in the US or the mestizo homicide rate, but still significantly higher than the white homicide rate for Western Europe. Now, again, some people could fault me here for not including Eastern Europe because there are some Eastern European countries that do have a fairly high homicide rate. Now, to that, I would say yes, but the thing is, US is considered a first world country, whereas most countries in Eastern Europe are not. Now, I mean, I could look at some of the wealthier ones in Eastern Europe. I'm pretty sure Czech Republic, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Slovenia, and Croatia are all pretty low, I think, whereas Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania are a bit higher. So yeah, those might be exceptions if like those countries are like borderline first world. Some of them might be first world, like Czech Republic and Slovenia. But yeah, if you look at Western Europe specifically, yes, the US does have a much higher homicide rate. So yeah, anyway, those are my thoughts on all that.